We're going to go ahead and get right into the topic of this video, which is to discuss and analyze my conversation with Bob Leitzel. This conversation that I had a week ago, I have been reflecting on. And I think that for the future reference, I'm probably going to do more of these analyzation videos to critically analyze how I performed, what I think I possibly had missed in the conversation. So, if you haven't watched it yet, we had a conversation with Bob Leitzel, the Romans 9 guy. I would highly encourage that you watch that video before watching this video because, well, that's the actual debate, and that's what we're going to be analyzing today. So going into this debate, I had in mind the idea that I wanted to make sure that Bob Leitzel was the same Bob Leitzel as he would be in other videos and other Christian audiences. I wanted to make sure that Bob was a consistent person, not only just in a comfortable Christian audience, but in front of somebody from another religion. I wanted to hold Bob to a standard of staying within Romans 9 and not going outside of the text to try to exegete it. Throughout this conversation, as I have reflected, I realized that there were key misunderstandings that hindered our ability to understand each other. And so we're going to go through some of them right now. One of the things that I missed was that trying to hold Bob to some of his other quotes from other videos, I really didn't understand why he would use the word chosen in multiple facets. In what I've experienced in conversations with other people who are Christians, who usually say they affirm Israel's chosenness, I find that when I ask them questions or when they will often muddy the waters of the chosen concept. And so what happened is that Bob, in his interview with Kevin Thompson 4 years ago, he had used the chosen concept in two different ways. Now, in my mind, I thought that Bob was being an irresponsible Christian theologian and equating the chosen concept as being loved or being blessed. And so throughout the conversation, I really, I'll say, interrogated Bob about that. Why would Bob use chosen in different ways? And why would he also suggest things such as there's no chosen concept? I think the confusion came from Bob knew what he was saying, but he used a word in a way that's not usually used that way. And for some reason, I never picked up that Bob could have understood what he was saying, but was just maybe using words that have specific meanings in the ways that they usually aren't meant. And in my reflections, I realized that Bob actually affirmed Israel as the chosen people and affirmed the election of the Jewish people more than I could hear for whatever reason. And I'm not making an excuse for that. That's the way it happened. And so, one of the other things that happened, a lot of people did not like how I held Bob to the Romans 9 guy title and did not allow him to go outside of the scripture Romans 9. Now, why did I do that? So, I have a rabbi who really hates chapters and verses. What do I mean by that? Not that he wants to get rid of chapters and verses, because used right, they can, well, if we open the scripture up, we can find specific portions in the letters and in the Torah without having to, I guess, skim through it all. So if used correctly, chapters and verses are actually very helpful. But what happens is that people assume that these chapters and verses existed when these things were written. Not only that, but oftentimes you will find in the Bible, they will attach headliners to these sections. And whether people mean to be helpful or not, what happens is that they actually distort the continuous linear thought that is being presented in these scriptural pieces. So when I had heard Bob call himself the Romans 9 guy, I thought it was the most absurd thing I had ever heard. Because in my mind, my thought process is, why would you isolate a scripture instead of at least being the expert of Romans 9, or excuse me, Romans, which still would fall under the fallacious premise of still isolating a scripture and saying you're an expert of this letter. Why wouldn't you just say you were an expert of the entire Bible? So in my hard-pressing and at times very interrogative approach, my thought was that Bob was being shallow in isolating Romans 9. And by repeating to him the premise that he's the Romans 9 guy was an attempt to show, in my mind, that I thought and demonstrate that I think that Bob Leitzel was being shallow in his theological approach. A lot of people didn't like this. They thought that I was being very rude. And I understand. But one of the things I tried to show Bob is that because throughout some of the other interview he had with Kevin Thompson, he was trying to exegete Romans 9 by going to other scriptures. And that's not logical thinking. The reason why is because it sets up the Romans to not be able to understand a letter without reading a letter in that time that was not widespread. They didn't have access to Ephesians or Galatians widespread like we do today. And so one of the things that Bob talks about is the Rosetta Stone. He considers parts of Ephesians or parts of Galatians as the Rosetta Stone, meaning that this is the key to understanding these verses. Now, what's interesting is that when I had pressed Bob about this, he said that it's easier to read this. Now, that's quite different. It being helpful to understand is quite different than it being you can't understand this without this. So that was one of the things that I really pressed Bob about, is why would you try to exegete Romans 9 without reading Romans 9? But then that brings up my mistake. So like I said, I was trying to make sure Bob Leitzel was a consistent theologian in a comfortable Christian audience versus being on a different religion. And so what I wanted to do was I want to ask him questions and then show him quotes from his other interviews. So one of the questions I had asked is about if chosen means blessed. And so then he had said that no, not exactly. And then I showed him a quote that it seems like he insinuates that Ishmael, Hagar, and Esau are blessed, therefore that they're chosen. So the problem that came from me is twofold. Number one, I rushed too quickly to these quotes. What I should have done is we really didn't spend a lot of time actually reading Romans 9. And I should have had Bob, what would have been a reasonable thing for me to do is ask him, okay, where does it talk about this chosen concept in Romans 9? And then we would read it. Maybe we have more questions about it, ask him about his understanding, and then maybe show him some of these quotes. But in my haste, I didn't do that for whatever reason. And so that didn't help the conversation. Number two, it became quite apparent that we were talking on two different, what would you say, viewpoints. And one of the things that I realize now is I was confused about his premise about trying to dispense with Calvinism. Now, Calvinism, in a nutshell, is the idea of the predestination of individuals being predestined to inherit salvation, while there are those who are predestined to not inherit salvation. So for me, as a non-Christian, I technically don't really have to know what Calvinism is, because it's outside of it's a Christian idea, and John Calvin was a figure outside of Judaism. So technically, I don't have to know who Calvin is, nor what Calvinism is. But the incredible confusion is that John Calvin proposed this idea of a different type of chosen concept of people being predestined to be rejected and others being predestined to be accepted. And so I did not understand that Bob was using chosen from a Calvinist's perspective, which was incredibly, I guess, added more to the confusion that he's talking from a Calvinist idea of chosen, which is not really what chosen has ever meant. And then I think of chosen as far as the chosen election of the Jewish people, and that's my only thought process when I hear the word chosen. So there was a huge misunderstanding as far as our ability to understand and actually have a conversation about some of these discussions. Since this interview with Bob Leitzel, I reached out to him and explained to him that I misunderstood his critiques and where he was coming from a lot. And thankfully, Bob, being a good sport, has responded, and we actually called on the phone. We talked about it. And so I thought I'd let you guys know that we are going to actually have Bob Leitzel again, and we're going to have him come on the show Saturday, and it'll be about Saturday, probably 5 p.m., 6 p.m. Last time I said it was 5 p.m., it was getting really close. I had some editing issues, so I'm going to say 5 to 6 p.m. is probably when that video is going to be up. So do be watching for that. And we're going to take a little bit of a different direction by Bob's recommendation. We're going to go through some scriptures from a Calvinist / predestination view, and he's going to give me some scriptures and ask me what I think about it, and he's going to present the Calvinist side. And then eventually we're going to get to where he would propose what he believes is the Jewish perspective of that would dispense with the Calvinist understanding of that text. So I think it's going to be really fascinating. I think it's going to be really informative, and it might be helpful for anybody who runs into some of these people who would experience or think about the predestination concept as an actual doctrine. So I just want to say thank you guys so much for watching this video, and do be ready to see that video with Bob Leitzel. Thanks so much.